the Gospel of John. We ended chapter 7 last week, beginning chapter 8. And chapter 7 ended with the religious leaders not knowing how to handle Jesus. They don't know what to do with Jesus. They can't out-debate him. They can't out-argue him. They can't out-theologize him. They can't capture him. They've tried to grab him and seize him, and he slips through. So they don't know what to do. So this week, they try and trap him. That's what we're going to see this week, is they lay a trap for him. And what they're going to see in this trap is they're going to put Jesus in a position where either he's got to not be loving and kind and merciful and forgiving, all these things that he's saying he is, or he's got to disobey the law and break one of the commands of the Bible. And so they're trying to put the trap on Jesus, but as we're going to see, anytime you try to trap Jesus, you end up being trapped. And so that's what ends up happening today. It's a popular Bible story. It's one that probably you've heard of before. Maybe what you don't know about it is if you're reading in your own Bible, you'll see when you come to the top of this section, there's a little heading in your Bible. And the little heading says this. It says, the earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 7, verse 53 through chapter 8, verse 11. And so you're like, what's going on there? Why is this in our Bible? Why does this say this? It should lead to some questions and some tough questions, and we're going to tackle that first before. You don't have to worry, you don't have to fret, you don't have to have concerns about the Bible, explain why, but I feel like before we get into the sermon, we've got to deal with this. We've got to deal with this little heading that's here in our Bible about the manuscript. And so let's talk about this just real quick, all right? This is sermon number 1, intro to sermon number 2, the real sermon, okay? So the Bible was originally written in scrolls, right? The New Testament was written in scrolls, on scrolls. And we don't have any of the original documents, which is not unique to the Bible. It's true for all ancient texts, that we don't have ancient texts, we don't have any of the originals. And so what scholars will do in dealing with ancient writings is there's two main arenas that they will live in the field of textual criticism, it's called. And textual criticism is where you kind of look at the trustworthiness and the veracity and the truthfulness of the text and how confident we are that they are the originals or close to the originals. And so in the field of textual criticism, you have two arenas. The first arena is copies, number of copies. How many copies of the manuscripts do we have? And more is better than just one. More is better, that you can compare apples to apples to apples to apples. The Bible has thousands of copies, right? More than any other ancient document. And the second arena is age of these copies. Older is better than newer. You want an older one that took place or was written very close to the events. That's what you want. And the Bible also has age on its side as well when it comes to ancient documents. We have copies that are less than 100 years away from when the events of the New Testament took place. So far and away, the Bible, in the field of textual criticism, by the way, the Bible is the most highly textual, criticized, analyzed book of all the ancient writings, right? They're always trying to find stuff wrong with the Bible. And so, far and away, the Bible has both number of copies and age of copies on its side. And so, when you go to the oldest copies of the Gospel of John, this story that we're going to cover today is not in there. Which is why they put this little editor's note to say the earliest manuscripts don't have this story in there, right? And so most biblical scholars believe that this story happened. It was an event in Jesus' life, but John, when he penned the Gospel of John, probably didn't have it in there. Okay, but it's a story that happened. There is a camp of scholars that believe that the story did happen. Right? It is a true story. It has the earmark of a true story. There's no new teaching in here that is kind of like contradicts other teaching. There's no doctrine issue in here that is going against any other doctrine. And so it is a legit part of the Gospels. We don't know for sure. Here's what we do know, right? Is that, and I'll just encourage you, if this kind of stuff stirs you up or this kind of stuff interests you, we did a whole series, if you remember, a year and a half ago. If you're new in the last year and a half, we did a whole series. It was called The Story back in the spring of 2022, like a year and a half ago, where we went through and I did a whole message on how we got the Bible and talked about the inspiration of the Bible, the writing of the Bible, the scribal process, the transmission of the Bible, the copying of the Bible, the interpretation of the Bible, all of that. You can go back and you can watch that. We did a real deep dive into that. And here's what you can know, that what I'm holding in my hands today and what you have is God's Word, that you can have confidence that God has written the Bible and He has preserved the Bible so that what we have is not just a book, but it is the book. It is the words of God. And so, even just something, just quick side note is you have the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered about 60 years ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls was a huge advancement, or just kind of confirmation for those of us in the Christian community, because up to this point, the earliest New Testament document we had was like 1100 AD. 1100 AD. So like 1,000 years after the events of the Bible took place. And then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved in these caves up in Qumran in Israel. We found scrolls, hundreds of them, and the earliest one dates back to 100. Okay, so 1,000 years newer, or older rather, than the one that we had. And when you compare the 1100 AD one with the 100 AD one, you know what we find? That they are 99.8% exactly the same, right? And so we have great confidence that the Bible that you and I have today is literally God's Word. So all of that is intro, right? All of that is not the sermon today. That was for free. That was intro this morning. We're in John chapter 8. John chapter 8 probably did happen. It did happen, and it's a story in the life of Jesus. There's great truth in it for us today, so we're going to unpack it. There's something for it in there for you and for me. So John chapter 8, verse 1, here's what it says. It left off, if you remember, we left off last week. They didn't know what to do with Jesus. They're trying to trap him. They don't know what to do, and it says they all turned around. They all went home. And then it says this, but Jesus didn't go home. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is this little hill outside the walls of Jerusalem. Again, when we go on our Israel trip, we'll go to the Mount of Olives. The Garden of Gethsemane is there. We'll go to the Garden of Gethsemane. You'll stand in the Mount of Olives. It becomes Jesus' favorite place to go. It's where he retreats. He prays. He goes on little God retreats there. And so it says, at dawn, verse 2, he went up to the temple again at dawn. By the way, I said this to the 8:30 crowd. They told me to give you a hard time because Jesus apparently was an early person. All right, he was a morning guy. And so at dawn, he went to the temple again, and all the people were coming to him. How'd you like to have a 6 o'clock church service, right? And he sat down and he began to teach them. So here's Jesus. He's not afraid, right? They're wanting to come after him. He's out in public and he starts teaching again. And verse 3 says, the scribes and the Pharisees. So here they are, the religious leaders that can't stand Jesus because he's not playing by their rules and he's not about religiosity. He's all about the heart. And so we'll talk more about that today. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, making her stand in the center. Teacher, they said to him, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? And they sit back and they're like, we got you. Because if Jesus says, you are right, stone her. Where's the love? Where's the grace? Where's the mercy? Where's the kindness? He will lose favor with the people and the Pharisees will win. Or if he says, no, we're not going to stone her. And the Pharisees say, well, that's what the law says. You can look it up. Leviticus chapter 20. By the way, side note, it's how serious God is. We'll talk more about it a little bit here, about sexual purity and adultery and all that. We're going to get a little awkward this morning. We're going to talk about it. It's here in the text. We've got to talk about it. In the Old Testament, commit adultery, you're stoned. It's how serious God was about preserving the sanctity of marriage and the covenant of of sexual union that happens within a marriage. And so if Jesus says, no, we're not going to stone her, then the Pharisees go, aha, we got you. You're breaking the law. You're breaking God's law. And they would arrest him. So they sit back and they say, what do you think we should do? And they think they got him, right? So it brings up all kinds of questions, right? This little scenario that is set up. Question number one is, it says that they caught her literally in the act of adultery, literally in the act, which is like, really in the act? So that would have been really, really hard to do, especially the Pharisees. There were like certain parts of town where certain kinds of people lived, like they just didn't go to. Side note, Pharisees, you remember what their name means? Remember what the name Pharisee means? 1,000 Bible trivia points, come on. What does the name Pharisee mean? It means, oh, I hear whispers. Say it confidently. You chickened out. It means the separate ones. The word Pharisee means the separate. That was the name they gave themselves, the separate ones, right? They were so high, so holy, so above everybody else, they called themselves the separate ones. That's what Pharisee means. And so they weren't going to those parts of town. They weren't hanging out with those kinds of people. So it's like, really, you caught this person in the very act? That's question number one. Question number two that comes up is, Who's missing here in the center of this story? The guy. Yeah, where's the guy, right? Last time I checked, it takes two to commit adultery, and so where's the dude, right? What? And in Leviticus 20, it doesn't say just bring the woman. It's actually both people are brought to be stoned. And so where's the guy? There's something fishy going on here. Something smells suspicious, and John tells us as much. I just got to read the next verse. It says this, they asked this to trap him, in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. So, they're asking this question not because they care about this woman. Like, hey, Jesus, can you help us out here? Like, we're in a tough church leadership situation, and we're trying to figure out how to shepherd this situation. We found these people. They were doing something they shouldn't have been doing. We're trying to figure out how to restore them and how to deal with them gently and lovingly, but it's really a hard situation. So, like, how do you think we should? That was not the heart behind their question at all. Their heart was, let's use this woman to set up a scene to try and trap Jesus so that we can prove that we're right. And that's what religiosity does. Religiosity hurts people. It doesn't care about the heart. It just wants to be self-righteous. It wants to look good. And I'm using this term, we've been using this term as we go throughout John. I use the term religion or religiosity in a negative sense, in the sense of where it's just outward conformity. It's like checking all the boxes, doing the do's, don't do the don'ts. Where Jesus is really after is your heart, like you for real. And when he has your heart for real, then you live the way that he really wants you to live, and it's not about religiosity. Religiosity just hurts people. Some of you know this all too well. You've been hurt by religion. Maybe you grew up in it, and you walked away from God for a season. You walked away from church because of religion, because of rules, not because of the love of Jesus, but because of religiosity. Religiosity hurts people. And here's what, if this story shows you anything, you have to see, don't lump Jesus in with religiosity. Jesus is fighting against religiosity. It's not the heart of Jesus. It's not the will of Jesus. It's not the action of Jesus. There's a big difference. So verse 6 goes on. It says, they asked this to trap him in order that they might have evidence to accuse him. And then this, Jesus stooped down and started writing on the ground with his finger. Right? So Jesus gets down and he starts writing in the dirt with his finger. What did he write? Nobody knows. We don't know what he wrote. The Bible doesn't tell us. Right? There's all kinds of theories. Right? I'll share 3 of them with you today for fun. We don't know. This is ultimately another one of those things when we get to heaven, we'll have to watch the DVD, be like, we can just ask Jesus, be like, hey, what did you write in the dirt with that whole thing with the woman? Right? What did you write? We don't know. One of the theories is he got down and he started writing out their sins. He started writing their sins in the dirt. One of the other theories is he was trying to jog their memory of the 10 Commandments. When God gave the 10 Commandments, notice it says he started writing on the ground with his finger. And then Exodus, we're going way back to Exodus when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. Notice the language. Exodus 31 says, when he finished speaking, he being God, speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he being God gave him the 2 tablets of the testimony, stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God. So maybe Jesus is trying to just jog their memory and make a connection, be like, hey, do you remember this whole thing? That he's showing them that he is God. Or maybe he's just trying to remind them, since they were the religious leaders, the pastors of the day, that maybe they should have known this verse in Jeremiah 17. Maybe he's trying to get them to remember Jeremiah 17 says this, Lord, the hope of Israel, all who abandon you will be put to shame. All who turn away from me will be written in the dirt, for they have abandoned the Lord, the fountain of living water. Maybe there's other theories out there. Who knows? We don't know. But Jesus started writing something in the dirt. They ain't giving up, though. They want to know, what do we do with this woman? Verse 7 says, they persisted in questioning him. And so he stood up and he said to them, the one without sin, you should be the first to throw a stone at her. And then he stooped down again and continued writing on the ground. That's it. One without sin, you go first. He goes down, he starts writing in the ground again. They don't know what to do with this. Right? This was not how this was supposed to go. We thought we had him. Shoot, now he's got us. What do we do? And so the verse says, verse 9, when they heard this, they left one by one, starting with the older men. They knew the gig was up early. And then look, notice this. Only he was left, Jesus, with the woman in the center. There it was. They were exposed. Their self-righteousness revealed. Their hypocrisy caught. The judges got put first in line to be judged by the only one who was the real judge. Right? The reality is there was only one person there who was without sin that could throw a stone, and that was who? There was only one sinless person there, Jesus. And he's not throwing stones. He's covering with love. He's protecting with grace. And this is what I want you to see, the major difference between religion and Jesus. Religion uses and shames and guilts. And Jesus protects with love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. But that's not how the story ends. You got to stay with it. Verse 10, Jesus stood up and he said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, Lord, she answered. Neither do I condemn you, said Jesus. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore. So, I mean, this whole story is just shocking, right? The heart of God displayed. And we get a real glimpse this morning, listen, because you and I are in this story. We get a glimpse of how God sees sinners. I'm the woman caught in adultery. You're the woman caught in adultery. We are all in this place. And there's a voice that wants to shout condemnation at you. And Jesus wants you to come to him so you can be covered with his grace and his love and his mercy. Right? I mean, was she guilty? Yeah. I mean, if they really did catch her in the act, it's questionable, but, right? It was a life sentence. I mean, that was the law. And so Jesus comes along and everything changes when she encounters Jesus. Now, he doesn't ignore her sin. He calls her actions sin. Right? But he doesn't excuse it. And he doesn't be like, well, just keep on doing that. He calls her action sin and calls her to turn from it and act. And that's actually this is the crazy thing about grace and mercy. When you really understand grace and mercy, some people say, oh, well, Jesus is easy on her. And so sin's not a big deal with Jesus. No. When you understand Jesus' grace and mercy, when you have been caught in your own sin and you understand how your sin is against a holy God and it breaks your heart because it doesn't break religiosity's heart. It's no big deal. But when you love Jesus, and he has your heart, and you're with him, and you know that your sin, see, this is why he could forgive sin, because he was going to die for it. You know that your sin put Jesus on the cross. It breaks your heart. You want to turn from it, and you want to turn back to him. And grace and mercy is not cheap. So when you understand the grace of God, Jesus didn't excuse her sin. He gave her a reason to turn from her sin and to start following him. That's what grace and mercy does. It's an amazing invitation to turn to the ways of Jesus. So, a couple thoughts regarding this passage here in John chapter. That's all we'll read today. Let me just give you a couple thoughts here. Here's the first thought, okay? This is important. Some of you need to hear this because you and I didn't grow up with this. And so you need to hear very loud and clear the heart of God this morning. At this point in Jesus' ministry, and still today, okay, Jesus comes offering grace and mercy and forgiveness and not condemnation. Not condemnation. Religiosity heaps on condemnation. Some of you walk around and you feel like you are always a disappointment to God. That you're not good enough. The reason you don't want to read this book is because it reminds you that you'll never be able to do it and you're not good enough. And you feel like a spiritual disappointment to your spiritual father. And it just puts a heaviness on you. It puts a guilt on you, a shame, a weight on you. And you need to know that is the spirit of religiosity, and that is not the spirit of God. Because here is what God says in Romans chapter 8, verse 1. If that's you walk around feeling you're never good enough, you're always feeling shame, you're always feeling guilty, you need to commit to memory this verse. Romans chapter 8, verse 1 says, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those, what? In Christ Jesus. In Christ. He looks at you and does not see your sin, does not see your shortcoming, does not see your faltering, does not see your issues. He looks at you through the lens of his love and his grace that has covered over all of our stuff. No condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. Some of you need to believe that today. You need to receive that today. You need to know that you are walking in grace. And this is what is so amazing about grace. No longer walking in sin and shame and condemnation, but instead walking in grace and mercy and forgiveness. That's why we've named this series, what do we call this series? Grace and Truth. And this is the beautiful picture of Jesus. It says in John chapter 1, he came full of grace. Right? So listen, before we get to the truth part, I want to talk the truth part just for a second. There's one other thing I want to talk to you here about grace. God doesn't condemn you. So, two things. One, you shouldn't condemn you. I've heard this from people. I know God forgives me. I just can't forgive me. There's no sin that you've committed that God can't forgive you of, and therefore you can't hold yourself to a higher standard than God is. Like, you're elevating yourself over God because I just can't forgive myself. Oh, so your standard is higher than God's standard? So God doesn't condemn you, you can't condemn yourself. And here's the second thing. Listen, God doesn't condemn us, so therefore we should not be condemners of the world. And this is where it's going to get a little hard. Because I don't know about you, but there's a lot of times when I look at the world and I want to pick up a rock. And I want to start throwing rocks at the ways of the world, at the wickedness of the world, at the things that are happening in our world. I think a lot of you're with me in this, right? Some of you got pockets full of rocks right now. You're like, yeah, I'm all in. Let's go. Sometimes we put names on our rocks. And this story today is an invitation to all of us to put down our rocks. That Jesus would say the same thing to you and me. Okay, you guys without the first sin, go ahead, you get to throw the first rock. To look in the mirror and to recognize that our God is not a rock thrower. He extends grace and mercy to us. Therefore, we should not be rock throwers. That we need to extend grace and mercy to those that we want to throw rocks at. And this is the hard part, because we live in a world that's going mad, and it feels like they need some rocks thrown at it, right? We have a culture. Let's get a little awkward and slightly offensive right now, that is running towards the cliff of sexual perversion and everything that's going on in our culture today with gender issues and kid issues. And I mean, it's a perversion of God's original good gift that he gave. I'll talk about this in a second. And here's the hard part for the church, is how do we not sacrifice the mission of God while getting mad at the world, right? So we have both these things. We have a mission to actually be engaged with and help bring love and grace to the very world that's running to the cliff in madness. And so it starts with putting down our rocks. It starts with recognizing you and I have no right to throw rocks, because God's not throwing them at us. So what right do we have to throw them at others? We're all lawbreakers. And so let's talk about this a little bit here. Adultery is brought up in, let's talk about adultery for a second, all right? Jesus calls it a sin. Let's talk about sexual sin for a little bit. Here's a biblical definition of adultery. Sexual intercourse of married people with somebody other than their spouse. It's the biblical definition of adultery. Right? The word is used in the Old Testament, both literally of the act of adultery and figuratively. The Hebrew word for adultery literally means breaking wedlock. That's what the word means, breaking wedlock. It's used figuratively in the Old Testament. God used it to speak to the nation of Israel and said, you're committing spiritual adultery on me. You're going out and you're having other loves, other lovers, other idols, other loves rather than me. And it was such a big deal to God that you want to read the book of Hosea. It's one of those there's 12 minor prophets, the end of the Old Testament. God called Hosea to speak to the people of Israel, to call them back to him, their first and only true love. And he did it by having Hosea marry a prostitute. To be a living parable for Israel to say, this is what you're doing to God. You're like prostituting our relationship. It's a crazy book of the Bible. But that's how serious God was about his love with his people. And so there's physical adultery, and in the Old Testament, there's spiritual adultery. It's going outside of marriage, sexually. Linked to this word for adultery is the word for fornication in the Bible. The word for fornication means this: sexual intercourse between persons not married. And so what you need to know is that in the beginning, God, who is the creator, creates. And so God created sex. It's God's good gift to mankind, to his people. The creator created the creation and gave the gift of sex. So it's God's creation. God's not a prude. He made it. He gave it to be in the confines of something else God created. Marriage, which is to be one man married to one woman forever in the bonds of covenant of marriage. That was God's plan, original design. That's the way God created it to be. And the gift of sex is given to man and woman in the covenant of marriage. And husbands and wives is a picture of God and his people. It's a representation of the way love, true love, is really supposed to work forever, the way God's love is towards us. And so the enemy has come. The enemy can't create. He's not a creator. He's a perverter. And so what he has always done from the beginning of time is twist God's creation and pervert God's creation. And that's what he's done with the gift of sex. And so it's done in all kinds of ways. And here's what you need to know. Anything outside the bounds of one man and one woman committed in covenantal marriage sexually, anything outside of that is a perversion of what God originally created. And so here's the hard part. We live in a culture that is so far from that even me saying it right now just sounds so outdated. It sounds so old-fashioned. It sounds so not just with it, because the whole culture is just running towards the cliff. And so we live in younger generation, you have it so hard right now because you're just flooded with it constantly in such a way that I think it makes the sexual revolution of the 60s look like child's play compared to what our teenagers are dealing with today when it comes to the way the culture is just running towards the cliff. And so it feels crazy to not go that way. It feels like you're so old-fashioned. Sex is one man, one woman forever in covenant of marriage. That's so, right? Because we live in a culture of just hookup culture and friends with benefits. I mean, there's apps designed where you just literally can find somebody for that night, just to like, and it's so far away from God. Well, let me tell you, C.S. Lewis years ago said this. It's not going to be on the screens. I just added it in last night. When the whole world is running towards a cliff, he who is running in the opposite direction appears to have lost his mind. That's what's happening right now. And so, young people, the challenge is, are you strong enough to not go with the flow of the culture towards the cliff? Because it feels like, why would I want to be different? Why would I want to stand out? And here's why. Let me tell you why. Listen to Uncle Joe, and he'll tell you why, the truth. And I say this to married couples I'm about to marry that are struggling with staying pure before marriage. I mean, the idea of being married, two virgins coming together, just seems like such a crazy thing today. It still happens, but it's so rare. Young people, I encourage you to stay committed to that. That's God's plan. Here's why you want God's plan. You want to be under the hand of God. This is what you want. This is the best way you can live life, is under the hand of God. Because when you're under the hand of God, you have his protection, you have his promises, you have his plan and his power and his purposes for your life. You have everything under the mighty hand of God. And when you decide to go your own way with the ways of the culture, you forfeit that. You forfeit the power of God and the plans of God and the purposes of God and the protection of God. And you come out, and the whole culture's running this way. And so for you, it feels incredibly odd, weird, old-fashioned, outdated to do this. But I'm promising you, this is the way, the best possible way to live life. The child of God stays under the hand of God to experience the blessings of God. And so everywhere you go, you have the hand of God with you. This is the best possible life you can have. Even though right now it feels like everybody else is having a time of their life out here, I promise you, they're going over the cliff. In church, we just got to figure out how do we not forfeit the mission of the church when we get mad at the world? Because I got news for you. If you haven't figured it out yet, it's only going to get worse. Like if you're waiting for us to get back to the old traditional values, it ain't going to happen. It is not going to, you gotta give up that mindset that we're going back. Because I've read the end of the story. It's going to get worse. And so if our answer is to throw rocks at the culture as it gets worse, as it runs to the cliff, we fail in the mission of God, in our madness. And so how do we do this? We got to be like Jesus. He was full of grace and truth. He called what she was doing sin. He didn't excuse it. He didn't make light of it. He called it sin. There is right and wrong. There is truth. There's not your truth and my truth and your truth. There is his truth. He's the creator. He gets to determine the laws of creation. And it's up to us as to whether you want to submit to it or not. He made you free. And you can decide. But I promise you, this is the best place for you to live. So, we all right? We need to find ourselves in the story here today. Because I'm the woman caught in adultery. You're the woman caught in adultery. Do you know God only has prodigal kids? Every single one of us, in some way, is a prodigal. So listen, you have kids that don't want what you want for them and have left the ways of the family. God goes, yeah, I get it. Welcome to the deal. He can identify. We got to find ourselves in the story and understand that the heart of God is love and grace and mercy that covers over our sin. For now. There will come a day where you will stand before the one who does have the right to judge. And on that day, his grace and his mercy and his righteousness that was available to you is now too late. You will stand before the judge. Court will be in session, and it's no, now I really want, no. It will be too late to really then accept the offer of Jesus, which is grace and mercy and forgiveness. How does he treat us in our grace, in our guilt and our shame? He treats us the same way that he treats this woman. I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful for God's amazing grace. One last thing I want to say. Worship team, come. One last thing I want to say, just because I feel like it's true, and I feel like it's part of the story, and it has to do with who was not shoved out in the middle with this woman that was shoved out in the middle. Who was it? The guy. Where is the guy? And maybe that might be you today. That you feel like, I'm getting away with it. I'm not getting caught. I'm not being shoved out in the middle. I'm not being exposed. Nobody knows. And that secret darkness that you have hidden in your heart, that you're not fighting against, that you're not saying, I hate this, I want to change. You're holding on to it, and you're enjoying it, and you just like not being exposed. You need to know. Maybe your spouse doesn't know. Maybe your parents don't know. Maybe your friends don't know. But there is one who does know. Jesus knows. And he sees it. And he might think you're getting away with it. I'm not just talking about sexual sin. I'm just talking about any area of darkness that we allow in our life. Jesus sees and Jesus knows. And his words to you today would be the same that he said to this woman 2,000 years ago. Go and sin no more. Come to him, be covered by grace and mercy, and know that there's a better way to stay right here under the hand of God. And so this morning we respond by this. Understanding that there's a difference between conviction and condemnation. Conviction's good. Conviction is from God. Conviction says, hey, stop, come back. Conviction calls you up. Condemnation, not from God, from the enemy. Condemnation whispers in your ear, you're no good. You're a hypocrite. You're a fake Christian. Condemnation is from the enemy. It puts you down. No, they feel the same sometimes. They might even sound the same. Huge difference from who they're from and their purpose. Conviction from God calls you up. Condemnation from the enemy keeps you down. Some of you just need to sit and enjoy the grace of God this morning. You've run on the treadmill of religiosity so long and you feel like you're just a spiritual failure. Just come and enjoy the grace of God, the goodness of God. What's so amazing about grace? It comes from a God who ends it or who offers it endlessly. So this morning, that's how we respond. We respond up. We respond this morning knowing that God is so good, you can't out-sin His grace, and it's always on the table because our God is a good God. So let's close. Let's respond in worship to the goodness of God. Let's stand and sing together.